The air was thick with tension, crackling like static. The world, for a split second, stood still. Then a voice sliced through the silence, unnatural, cold, yet undeniably clear. "They're already here." The words reverberated across the airwaves, sinking into the bones of everyone who heard them. A shudder ran down humanity's spine. Panic was the first to follow. A pulse of static filled the communication systems before a chaotic, garbled sound overtook it. The room shook with the eerie frequency, the noise growing louder, more insistent. Slowly, the mess of signals began to form into something coherent. An alien transmission. No longer incomprehensible, it began to resonate with the promise of something much more frightening. This wasn't just a message, it was an arrival. People gathered in the streets, staring at screens as the transmission took hold. The government scrambled to maintain control, but the truth was undeniable. The truth was already out. The protagonist stood, frozen, as the weight of it all came crashing down. "We've been waiting for you." As the world began to piece together the significance of the alien transmission, the government's efforts to suppress the truth only made the situation worse. Authorities scrambled, desperate to control the narrative, to silence the growing fear spreading across the streets. But no amount of denial or censorship could hold back the inevitable. Citizens poured into the streets, their faces filled with dread and disbelief. The message was clear now, more than just words. It was an invitation, a warning, and a declaration of war. The protagonist stood amidst the chaos, eyes scanning the faces around them, all of them reflecting the same fear, the same uncertainty. For the first time in history, the whole world shared a collective fear, united by the truth. Humanity was no longer alone. And as the static pulse continued to vibrate through the air, the protagonist felt a cold chill crawl up their spine. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Inside the government's secure underground facility, leaders and officials debated frantically. The alien transmission had not only penetrated the airwaves, but had begun to infiltrate all global communication channels. Every broadcast, every news outlet, was now filled with the same eerie message. The walls of the conference room seemed to close in on the protagonist, as they sat in disbelief, listening to the discussions around them. "We can't ignore this anymore," one official said, voice trembling. "They're here and they're not going away." The protagonist felt a wave of nausea rise in their stomach. Every assumption, every piece of history they had trusted, was now crumbling in front of them. This was no longer just a distant threat. It was real. It was here. And there was no escape from the coming storm. The protagonist stumbled out of the underground facility, their minds swirling with confusion. The world outside was a stark contrast. The streets were filled with crowds of people, shouting, some panicking, others demanding answers. The news broadcasts blared from every corner, repeating the alien message over and over. The protagonist walked through the chaos, their steps slow and unsure, as if the ground itself had been pulled out from under them. No one had answers, and the government's attempts to control the situation only seemed to deepen the chaos. With every passing minute, it became more and more evident. This was no longer something that could be ignored or hidden. The truth was out. The world had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. As the protagonist wandered deeper into the city, they noticed the strange calm that had overtaken certain groups of people. While others ran in fear, these individuals seemed almost resigned. The static pulse from the alien transmission was now a constant hum in the air, reverberating in the very ground beneath their feet. As the protagonist walked past them, a woman in the crowd caught their eye. Her gaze was unnervingly calm, as though she had known this moment was coming for years. "We've been waiting for you," she whispered under her breath, a strange, unsettling smile playing on her lips. The protagonist froze. Who was she? Why did she sound as though she knew something they didn't? The static continued, louder than ever, and the protagonist's heart skipped a beat. The world was changing, but no one could have anticipated just how deep this change would go. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was at play. The alien message had been decoded, but no answers were forthcoming from the government. The public was fed lies, vague explanations, and hollow reassurances. As the protagonist dug deeper, they uncovered something horrifying. There were whispers, rumors of factions within the government working with the aliens. The more they learned, the more they realized the truth was being kept from them. Powerful people, the ones they had trusted their entire life, were hiding things that tied Earth's future to forces far beyond their comprehension. But these were no mere whispers. These were facts buried beneath layers of red tape and corporate interests. In the shadows, unseen and undetected, humanity's greatest enemy wasn't the aliens themselves. It was the corruption within their own ranks. The protagonist knew they had to act, but who could they trust when everyone seemed complicit? Late at night, the protagonist met with an anonymous source, a shadow in the night who claimed to know everything about the government's dealings with the aliens. The informant handed over a hard drive containing classified files. "This is the truth," they whispered, looking over their shoulder, ensuring no one was watching. The protagonist's hands trembled as they accepted the files, the weight of the discovery setting in. As they examined the documents, the horrifying truth was revealed. Humanity's leaders had been working with alien forces for decades, manipulating global events, orchestrating wars, and hiding the reality of extraterrestrial contact from the public. The implications were catastrophic. The protagonist could barely comprehend it. But one thing was clear. Humanity had been nothing more than pawns in a galactic game. The protagonist needed to confront this corruption, but the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the path became. Days passed, and the protagonist continued to unravel the conspiracy. But with each piece of information they uncovered, the danger increased. They reached out to their closest ally, someone they trusted completely. The conversation started innocently, but it quickly took a turn for the worse. As they sat across from their ally, the protagonist's friend seemed strangely distant, too calm. "You've been digging into things you don't understand," the ally warned, their tone too measured, too controlled. That's when the truth hit the protagonist like a freight train. Their closest ally wasn't who they claimed to be. In that heart-stopping moment, the ally revealed their true nature. They were an alien sleeper agent. "You think I don't remember?" the ally hissed, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The betrayal cut deep, more deeply than the protagonist could have ever imagined. Everything they thought they knew, everything they believed in, had been a lie. Reeling from the betrayal, the protagonist fled, their heart pounding in their chest. The world felt like it was closing in around them. Every face they saw seemed suspect. Every movement in the corner of their eye felt like a threat. As they walked through the darkened streets, thoughts raced through their mind. How had they been so blind? How had they failed to see what was right in front of them? The alien forces were closer than they had ever feared. But it wasn't just the extraterrestrials they had to worry about. It was the betrayal of the people they had once trusted. It was the realization that the very foundation of the world had been manipulated by unseen forces. The government, their closest friends, everything was a lie. They were alone now, in a war that had already begun, with no one left to trust but themselves. The protagonist's hands clenched into fists. They had to fight back. But how? With nowhere else to turn, the protagonist decided to confront the government. They broke into a high-security facility, bypassing guards and security systems. Their heart was pounding, but there was no turning back now. As they hacked into the system, the screens lit up with information, evidence of the government's dealings with the aliens. Hidden contracts, research projects, secret meetings, everything was laid bare. The protagonist's hands shook as they copied the files. This was the smoking gun, the truth that could expose everything. But just as they were about to leave, alarms blared. The facility's security systems had detected the breach. The protagonist was trapped. They had uncovered the truth, but now they had to escape with it, alive. The files were only the beginning. The protagonist dove deeper into the web of secrets, pushing further into the heart of the conspiracy. As they sifted through the files, they uncovered something even more disturbing. Humanity wasn't just dealing with an alien invasion, it was being controlled by it. The alien forces had embedded themselves within Earth's leadership for decades, guiding global events to suit their own purposes. But the most chilling revelation was the realization that the aliens were not just invaders, they were collaborators. The factions of Earth's government had secretly allied with the alien invaders, not as victims, but as willing partners. Earth had become a pawn in a galactic scheme far beyond the protagonist's wildest imagination. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and the protagonist could no longer trust anyone. The forces at play were far bigger than they had ever known. The more the protagonist learned, the more it became clear. They weren't just uncovering secrets, they were digging up their own past. The files spoke of experiments conducted decades ago, biological research on human DNA, and the shocking connection to their own family. The protagonist's bloodline, one they had never thought twice about, was tied to the extraterrestrial plot in ways they couldn't comprehend. They found a family member's name linked to these experiments, a name long buried in history, concealed by a veil of lies. The revelations were too much to bear. The protagonist couldn't understand why their family had been part of this conspiracy, or how they were linked to the aliens. But the cold truth settled in. Their lineage was the key. Their bloodline was why this invasion was happening, and they had been unknowingly groomed for a role in the war all along. The burden of this truth threatened to crush them. The protagonist's mind raced as they tried to process the overwhelming flood of information. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that every step they had taken in their life had been guided by unseen hands. The alien forces weren't just a threat. They were orchestrating the future of humanity from the shadows. But the truth was even worse than that. The protagonist's entire sense of self was a lie. They had always believed they were ordinary, that their family was just like any other. But now they understood, they were never meant to be ordinary. Their role in the alien conspiracy was predestined. A bloodline chosen long ago. The protagonist's mind reeled as they sat, staring at the data in front of them. They weren't just a witness to this grand scheme, they were a part of it. The revelation was as horrifying as it was profound. They were the key to the war, and they didn't know whether that meant salvation or destruction for humanity. As the truth about their bloodlines sank in, the protagonist's reality seemed to distort. They were no longer a passive observer of the invasion. They were a key player in a game they had no control over. The alien forces were closing in, their power growing stronger every day. And yet, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Everywhere they went, shadows seemed to follow them, faces in the crowd no longer trusted. The deeper they delved into the conspiracy, the more dangerous it became. Their closest allies had betrayed them, and now they couldn't even trust their own family. Everyone had a part to play in this grand design. And no matter how much the protagonist tried to deny it, they knew their next steps would be decisive. The aliens were coming for them, not just as a threat to Earth, but as the culmination of a decades-long plot, and they were the only one who could stop it, or be consumed by it. The protagonist, now consumed by the truth, had no choice but to confront the people who had orchestrated this nightmare. Their bloodline had been marked for this role, but they had to decide whether to embrace it or fight against it. The weight of the decision was crushing. If they accepted their role, they could use their connection to the alien forces to defeat them. But doing so would mean losing their humanity forever. The aliens had their plans, and they needed the protagonist to fulfill them. The final choice had come down to one question. Would the protagonist sacrifice their own soul to save humanity, or would they expose the truth, knowing it would tear the world apart? As they stared into the darkness, the protagonist realized that no matter what choice they made, there would be no going back. The cost of the truth was high, but the price of ignorance was far worse. The protagonist was thrust into the deepest chamber of their darkest fears, when they learned the full extent of their bloodline's involvement in the invasion. The truth hit them with the weight of an atomic bomb. They were the key. Their family's legacy wasn't one of peace or honor, but of a blood pact made long before their birth. Their ancestors had willingly entered into a silent war with the aliens, offering Earth as a resource in exchange for protection and power. It was a chilling pact, one that had been carried forward, unbeknownst to generations of humans. The protagonist was the last in line, the one chosen to fulfill the promise made long ago. Their very existence had been planned as the final piece to unlock the full alien occupation. There was no escaping it now. The protagonist's bloodline was irrevocably tied to the fate of humanity, and the alien forces were intent on using them to bring about the final phase of the invasion. The burden was crushing, the truth unbearable. The protagonist could feel the walls of their reality closing in. Everything they thought they knew about their life had been shattered. The legacy of betrayal had been passed down from one generation to the next, and now they were the unwitting inheritors of this dark secret. But the truth was more than they could bear. Their family had chosen to cooperate with the aliens in exchange for power and survival, sacrificing countless human lives for their own benefit. The protagonist felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and rage. How could they stand by while their ancestors paved the way for the destruction of their own species? The alien forces, once thought to be the enemy, were not the true invaders. The real threat was humanity itself, led astray by greed and manipulation. The protagonist faced an agonizing choice: join the aliens and fulfill their family's role, or betray everything their bloodline had worked toward and expose the truth, knowing it would destroy the fragile peace humanity had left. The protagonist's internal struggle reached its breaking point. They were haunted by the faces of those who had been manipulated, by the innocent lives caught in the crossfire of this intergalactic game. The realization that their family was complicit in the destruction of Earth's future shattered their sense of self. But there was still hope, a sliver of a chance to undo the damage. The protagonist knew the alien forces were using them, manipulating their bloodline to carry out the final phase of their invasion. If they didn't act soon, Earth would fall forever under alien control. The protagonist sought out those they once trusted, hoping to gather allies. But no one would listen. The deeper the protagonist dug, the more they saw the pervasive influence of the aliens embedded in every level of society. In the shadows, they were no longer just a person. They were a weapon to be used by forces beyond their understanding. The protagonist's frustration boiled over as they realized they had no one left to turn to. The alien forces were closing in, and humanity seemed powerless to stop them. The government had already been compromised, and the public was too divided to act. The protagonist was now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. They were the last hope, the only person who could reveal the truth and stop the invasion from succeeding. But the cost of this knowledge was devastating. The protagonist had learned things they couldn't unlearn, seen truths that couldn't be unseen. The burden of the truth weighed heavily on their shoulders, as they considered the price they would have to pay. Betraying their family, their bloodline, and the promises made centuries ago was no easy decision. But the consequences of inaction were far worse. As the protagonist made their decision, the air around them felt thick with the coming storm. The final battle for Earth was about to begin. The protagonist, standing at the precipice of their choice, realized that this battle wasn't just about saving Earth. It was about saving themselves from becoming what they feared most. The alien forces had been manipulating humanity for so long that they had almost forgotten what it meant to be human. But the protagonist still had a chance to fight back, to break the cycle of betrayal and subjugation. But it would come at a price. The protagonist was torn between the truth they now held and the irreversible consequences that would follow. To expose the conspiracy would mean tearing apart the very fabric of society. But to stay silent, to accept the fate their bloodline had set for them, would mean the destruction of everything they had ever known. The protagonist's hands tightened into fists. No matter what, they would no longer be a pawn. The final choice had come. The protagonist stood at the edge, overwhelmed by the weight of their choices. The alien forces had grown too powerful, and the time to act had come. They had spent too long questioning whether they could make a difference, whether they were strong enough to confront the truth. But now, the only thing left was to decide. Should they use the alien technology to fight back, knowing it could make them less human, or should they expose the conspiracy and risk humanity's survival? The alien technology was powerful, a weapon of unimaginable destruction, but it came with a price. Using it could grant the protagonist the power to destroy the invaders, but it would strip away their humanity in the process. The lines between right and wrong blurred as the protagonist considered the alternatives. Was the survival of humanity worth sacrificing their soul? The final showdown was near, and there was no more time to hesitate. The decision was agonizing, but the protagonist knew that inaction would lead to Earth's destruction. The alien forces had been infiltrating humanity for decades, manipulating everything from the shadows, and if they didn't act now, Earth would fall under their control forever. With the alien technology in their hands, the protagonist knew that they had the means to end this, to fight back. But there was a lingering fear that using the technology would irrevocably change them. The closer they got to the technology, the more they felt the alien presence, its power, its pull. The temptation to give in and use it for the greater good was immense. But was it truly for the greater good, or was it another form of control? The protagonist couldn't be sure. With every passing moment, the decision grew more urgent, and the protagonist felt themselves slipping deeper into the unknown. As the protagonist prepared to use the alien technology, they were confronted by the last person they ever expected to see, their closest ally, the one who had once betrayed them. Their ally stood at the door, staring with an unreadable expression. "You can't do this," they said, their voice soft but firm. The power in that device, it's not just a weapon, it's an invitation. The protagonist froze, the weight of those words sinking in. The technology wasn't just a tool to fight the aliens, it was a bridge, a gateway to something much worse. Their ally's warning struck home. The device was not only a means to wage war, it was a means to control the universe, to access a power that could transcend everything. "You can't become them," their ally continued, stepping closer, their voice trembling with emotion. "Don't let them win." The protagonist stood torn, unable to move, as the true cost of their decision became clear. The protagonist was overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions coursing through them. The time for hesitation was long past. The alien forces were at their doorstep, and humanity's future hung in the balance. The protagonist's bloodline, their family's legacy, had led them to this moment, but it was their choice that would define the future. The alien technology pulsed in their hands, calling to them, promising the power to end this war and free humanity. But it came with a cost, a loss of everything that made them human. The protagonist's mind raced as they considered the path ahead. To use the weapon would mean losing themselves, becoming a tool of the very forces they were trying to defeat. But to expose the truth, to confront humanity with the full extent of the conspiracy, might destroy the fragile hope that remained. Either way, the protagonist knew there was no going back. They had to choose, and they had to do it now. The protagonist's heart pounded as they made the final choice. They couldn't allow themselves to be consumed by the alien technology, couldn't allow the forces of control to win. With a final breath, they turned their back on the weapon, choosing to expose the truth to the world instead. It was a painful decision, knowing it might tear humanity apart, but it was the only way to stop the cycle of betrayal. The protagonist knew the consequences of their choice. The world would be thrown into chaos, but it was the only path that could potentially lead to freedom. The alien forces might have manipulated everything, but they couldn't control the truth. And the truth was more powerful than any weapon. As the protagonist stepped out into the world, ready to confront the consequences, they understood that this was just the beginning. The battle for humanity's soul had only just begun. The dust had settled, but the world was irrevocably changed. The protagonist's decision to expose the truth had sent shockwaves across the globe. The once cohesive fabric of society had been torn apart. Governments collapsed, public trust shattered, and chaos reigned as people struggled to make sense of the horrifying revelation. The protagonist walked through the streets, their eyes hollow, their heart heavy with the burden of what they had done. The alien forces had been forced back, but the war was far from over. The world had learned too much to ever return to normal. Some people rallied around the protagonist, seeing them as a hero, while others viewed them as the cause of the chaos. The protagonist was caught in the middle, neither celebrated nor condemned, just a symbol of humanity's fractured future. The battle was over, but the consequences had only just begun. In the aftermath of the truth being exposed, humanity struggled to rebuild. Some tried to push forward, determined to recover, while others turned inward, fearful of the unknown. The protagonist watched from the sidelines, unsure of what role they had left to play in this fractured world. The truth had been unleashed, but it was a double-edged sword. The alien forces had been pushed back, but their influence lingered. Alien technology was now scattered across the globe, and factions with their own agendas were fighting for control. The protagonist had no choice but to remain vigilant. The war had shifted from an external battle with extraterrestrials to an internal conflict, one where humanity had to confront its own demons. The protagonist knew that their role in this fight was far from over, but they were no longer certain what the next step would be. The future was uncertain, and the lines between ally and enemy had blurred. The protagonist had become a symbol, but not the one they had hoped for. They were now both a beacon of hope and a lightning rod for the world's anger. Every corner of the globe seemed to be asking the same question: what now? The protagonist couldn't provide an answer. Every effort to unite the fractured world fell apart as old powers fought to reclaim control, and new factions emerged, eager to exploit the chaos for their own gain. The protagonist's eyes had seen too much, too many secrets, too much betrayal, and too many broken promises. The truth had freed humanity, but it had also exposed their greatest flaws. The protagonist's heart felt heavy with the realization that in the end, the greatest battle wasn't against the aliens, but against the darkness within humanity itself. The struggle to rebuild would be harder than any war. And no matter how much they wished it weren't true, the protagonist knew that they would be called upon again. As the protagonist looked around at the chaos, they realized that they were no longer just a participant in the struggle. They had become its embodiment. Their decision to expose the truth had irrevocably altered the course of history. The alien forces may have been pushed back for now, but the war had taken on a new form. Humanity was at war with itself. The world was split, with some desperate to hold on to the old ways, others pushing for something new. The protagonist had always believed in the strength of humanity, but now they weren't so sure. How could they lead when no one knew what they were fighting for anymore? The old world was gone, and with it, the old sense of hope. But the protagonist knew that if humanity was to survive, they would need to find a new path forward, one that wasn't defined by alien manipulation, but by their own choices. The protagonist had to believe that humanity could still change, that they could choose a better future. The protagonist stepped into the unknown, fully aware that their journey was far from over. Humanity had been given a second chance, but they would have to fight for it. The final battle against the alien invaders had been won, but the war for humanity's future was only just beginning. The protagonist had been torn between their own fears and the needs of the world, but now they understood that the true battle was one of leadership, vision, and sacrifice. Their decisions would shape the future, and they couldn't afford to make another mistake. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but the protagonist was no longer the person they had been before the truth was exposed. They were scarred, but they were also stronger. And in that strength, they found the resolve to keep fighting, to guide humanity toward a future where it could stand on its own, free from the influence of those who had once sought to control it. The world was recovering, but it was a fragile recovery. The revelation of the alien conspiracy had changed everything. Humanity was no longer naive, no longer blind to the truth. But with that knowledge came a new set of challenges. People had seen the depths of betrayal, and now they had to live with the consequences. The protagonist stood at the forefront of a movement that sought to unite the fractured world, but the path ahead was unclear. Every step forward felt like a leap into the unknown, with new dangers emerging on all sides. Factions that had once been allies now turned on each other, and old alliances were tested by the weight of the truth. The protagonist knew that while the battle for Earth had been won, the war for humanity's future was far from over. The world had changed, and now it was up to humanity to decide what kind of world they wanted to rebuild. The protagonist's role had shifted. No longer just a survivor, they had become a leader, a symbol of hope, but also a target. Some still saw them as a hero, while others viewed them as the one who had brought the truth to light, unleashing chaos. As the protagonist navigated through the divided factions, they began to realize that the true struggle wasn't just against external forces. It was the internal battle within humanity itself. The scars of betrayal were deep, and no amount of unity could erase the pain that had been inflicted. The protagonist's heart ached for the people they were trying to help. They had given everything to expose the truth, but now they were faced with the even greater challenge of healing a fractured world. The cost of truth had been immense, and yet, there was still a glimmer of hope that humanity could find its way forward, if they chose to. As time passed, the protagonist began to realize that true peace wouldn't come through force or control. It would come through understanding. The alien forces had manipulated humanity, but now, it was humanity's turn to take control of its own destiny. The protagonist sought out the remnants of the alien technology that still lay scattered across the Earth, hoping to find a way to use it to rebuild. But every encounter with the alien technology left them with a growing fear. It was too powerful, too dangerous. Even in the hands of well-meaning people, it could become a tool of oppression. The protagonist had learned from their mistakes. Humanity had the power to destroy itself, but it also had the power to heal. The protagonist knew that the future would be shaped not by what had been done to humanity, but by what humanity chose to do with the power it had now. The protagonist's journey had come full circle. From the first chilling alien transmission to the painful revelations of betrayal and manipulation, they had learned more than anyone could have ever expected. Now, standing at the crossroads of humanity's future, the protagonist faced an impossible decision: to keep the knowledge of the alien technology hidden, or to share it with the world, knowing it could bring both salvation and destruction. The protagonist understood the power of choice. They had seen how easily humanity could be swayed, how fragile the balance of power was. But the time had come for humanity to decide its own fate. The protagonist could no longer be the leader they had been. It was time for the people to take control. The burden of the future was now in their hands. Would they choose wisely, or would they repeat the mistakes of the past? The decision had been made. The protagonist had chosen to reveal the truth about the alien technology, but not for control, for unity. It was time for humanity to come together, to accept the consequences of the past, and forge a new path. There would be no more lies, no more manipulation. The road to healing would be long and difficult, but the protagonist believed in humanity's ability to change. As the protagonist walked away from the council, they knew that this was only the beginning. The world was scarred, but it was not beyond saving. The protagonist had sacrificed their past, their family's legacy, but in doing so, they had given humanity a chance at redemption. They would not be the hero the world wanted, but they would be the leader the world needed. And in the end, that was enough.